They say the first thing you noticed was the smell. Not rot exactly, but something older than decay. Bone dust and damp cloth. A breath held too long inside a house that had forgotten the sun. When the door opened, it did not creak. It sighed, as if relieved to finally let something escape. Inside, faces were hidden. Not turned away, but erased. Clothes stretched tight where mouths should have been. Eye holes stitched too carefully, as though whoever made them had practiced for years, maybe generations. The women did not scream. They had learned early that screaming changed nothing. Their bodies carried the scream instead, folded into jawlines that never aligned, skulls that grew like arguments left unresolved. Flesh obeyed rules written long before they were born, rules etched into blood. Rules repeated like prayers, whispered between cousins, between brothers and sisters who were told there was no one else. In those mountains, night came early. It slid down the trees and settled into valleys where roads ended and names were reused until they lost meaning. Children were born into houses that remembered too much. Beds where parents slept had once belonged to grandparents who had shared the same last name. Family trees did not branch there. They collapsed inward, ring after ring, until roots strangled themselves. If you listen closely to the stories told by old men who refuse to look you in the eye, they never begin with birth. They begin with hiding. Curtains nailed shut, mirrors removed, windows painted over from the inside. The first rule was always the same. Do not let the outside see what the inside has done. It is said that even alone, the women wore their masks, cloth against skin, until the line between covering and face dissolved. They became something else then, not daughters, not sisters, not evidence, just shapes moving through dim rooms, hands busy with sewing, mending, feeding animals that did not recoil. Goats did not flinch. Chickens did not stare. Animals never asked who your father was, or why he shared a grandfather with your mother. There is a moment, right before the story goes deeper, where the voice is lower, where the teller leans closer, as if afraid the walls might remember. That moment is now. Before we go further, tell me this quietly, as if no one else can hear. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because time matters in stories like this. Hours stretch differently in isolated places. Decades fold into habits. A marriage becomes tradition. Tradition becomes law, and law becomes flesh. The house in the mountains did not look cursed from the road. That is always how it begins. Weathered wood. A porch repaired too many times. Smoke rising steady from a chimney that had never stopped burning. But inside those walls, history did not sleep. It watched, it waited, and it shaped the children long before they understood what shape even meant. The first girl was born with a jaw that never closed properly. They said it was God's will. The second with eyes that refused to agree on where to look. The third with a skull that grew wrong, as if trying to escape itself. Each birth explained away with scripture, with silence, with the assurance that this was how it had always been. And it had. Because long before the masks, long before the doctor's notes and sealed records, the family had already made its choice. To turn inward, to survive alone, to carry their sins quietly, stitched into cloth and worn against the face. That choice did not stay buried. It never does. The land that held them was not marked on most maps. Old survey lines blurred there, as if the ink itself had grown uncertain. The mountains rose unevenly, scarred by cuts where timber companies had come and gone, leaving behind stumps that looked like broken teeth. Roads narrowed into paths, paths into nothing. In county records, the area appeared as a blank between townships, a place defined more by what it lacked than what it held. Settlers arrived there in the early 19th century, carrying Bibles, grudges, and a hunger to disappear. Church minutes from the 1830s mention entire families relocating at once, selling usable land for cheaper plots deeper in the hills. The reason was always vague: religious disagreement, moral contamination, the corruption of cities, words that meant less explanation and more distance. They built houses far apart, then slowly drifted back together, bound not by neighbors but by blood. Isolation was not accidental, it was cultivated. Children were taught which paths led nowhere and which questions were dangerous. Schooling ended early. Names repeated. A boy named after his uncle married a girl named after her aunt. When outsiders passed through, they were watched until they left, their footsteps memorized, their faces discussed long after they disappeared down the road. By the time the 20th century arrived, the family at the center of this story had already folded itself inward several times. Census documents show the same surnames occupying the same properties for decades. Parish records list marriages between first cousins, then quietly omit the degree of relation in later entries, as if the paper itself had grown ashamed. Birth certificates mention complications without description. Deaths are recorded early, causes vague, often attributed to weakness or the lungs. The house where the sisters lived had been rebuilt over an older foundation. Stone blocks laid by hands that had also signed marriage licenses bearing the same names. Beneath the floorboards were objects no one displayed: hair ribbons, small shoes, a cracked mirror wrapped in cloth and hidden away, never thrown out. The past was not discarded there. It was stored. Neighbors spoke little, but they noticed patterns. Curtains never opened. Laundry hung only at night. The brother, the one whose face carried fewer marks, handled all exchanges. He went into town alone. He spoke politely, briefly, always with a sense of urgency, as though remaining too long among strangers might invite inspection. In the wider world, laws changed, medical understanding advanced. Warnings about close, kin marriage appeared in pamphlets and public health notices. None of it reached the house in the mountains in any meaningful way. When it did, it was filtered through sermons that framed suffering as purification, pain as inheritance, deformity as proof of endurance. Children born there learned quickly what was expected of them. The girls stayed inside. They sued. They cleaned. They learned to keep their heads slightly lowered, not in shame, but in habit. The boys learned silence, learned that questions had consequences, learned that some truths were safer when never spoken aloud. By the 1930s, the sisters were growing into bodies shaped by decisions made long before their birth. Their reflections were avoided, not out of superstition, but out of practicality. Seeing oneself clearly required light. Light invited comparison. Comparison led to grief. So the house remained dim. Lamps burned low even at noon, and when cloth first touched skin. When the first mask was sewn not for play, but for necessity, no one argued. It was simply understood that this, too, was part of the family tradition. The first child was delivered on a winter morning when the ground was too hard to dig. Snow pressed against the house like a held breath. The midwife, a woman who had assisted in enough births to know when something was wrong, noticed immediately that the baby's cry sounded strained, pulled through a mouth that did not open the way it should. She said nothing. Silence was part of her training in those hills. As the girl grew, her face resisted symmetry. The jaw lagged, teeth crowded in places meant for air. One eye drifted slightly, as if already trying to look away. Her mother held her longer than necessary, not out of affection, but calculation. She had seen this before in cousins, in aunts whose portraits were kept only in drawers. The name chosen for the child had been used before too. Names were recycled like clothing, passed down until they thinned. By the time the second girl was born, no one pretended surprise. The labor was longer, the head larger, misshapen in ways that would worsen with time. The third arrived small, quiet, struggling for breath from the moment she entered the world. Each birth reinforced what the family already knew but refused to name. This was not misfortune. It was pattern. The girls were kept close. They learned the house by touch. Where the floor dipped near the stairs. Which boards complained when stepped on. How to move without sound. Outside, the forest watched them grow. Inside, their bodies carried the forest's isolation in bone and cartilage. The masks appeared slowly, not as a single decision, but as a series of small ones. A scarf worn longer than needed. A cloth held over the mouth when visitors passed by the gate. Eventually, fabric cut and stitched with care. The mother worked at night, candlelight trembling over her hands. She chose dark material, thick enough to hide shadows. The eye holes were measured precisely. Too large invited scrutiny. Too small suggested fear. When the girls first wore them, they cried, not from pain, but from the weight of understanding. Something had ended. Childhood, perhaps. Or the possibility of being seen as anything other than what they were becoming. The masks were not removed for meals. They learned to eat carefully, lifting cloth just enough to slip food inside. Speech grew muffled, then minimal. Words were expensive, silence cost less. In town, rumors moved faster than facts. Children whispered about monsters in the hills. Adults corrected them gently, firmly, without explanation. Curiosity was discouraged. Pity even more so. The family had lived there too long to be challenged now. They were part of the landscape. Like a dangerous bend in the road everyone learned to avoid. As the sisters aged, their conditions deepened. Hearing faded, spines curved, breathing became labor. Medical help was suggested once, quietly, by a traveling doctor who noticed the brother's stiffness when he spoke of his sisters. The offer was declined with courtesy and finality. Outsiders did not fix what had been sanctified. The girls developed rituals of their own. They woke before dawn to work the garden while light was still uncertain. They bathed after dark. They avoided mirrors with an intensity that bordered on devotion. In private moments, one of them sometimes traced the outline of her mask with trembling fingers, as if memorizing a face she wished belonged to her. They were not cruel. They were not bitter. They were careful. That was the quality that defined them. Careful with movement, careful with sound, careful with hope. Because hope, in that house, was the most dangerous thing of all. And beneath every careful gesture lay a truth waiting to surface. A truth written into their bones, growing louder as they did. At night, the house changed its voice. Wood contracted. Pipes knocked softly like hesitant fingers. Wind slipped through cracks and made the walls whisper names no one answered. The sisters lay awake listening, bodies arranged to ease pain that never fully left them. Sleep came in fragments, broken by breath that caught her ears that rang without sound. They began to notice things about themselves that felt older than memory. The way their movements mirrored one another without planning. How they finished each other's tasks without speaking. How they sometimes felt emotions that did not belong to them alone. Grief arrived as a shared weight. Fear traveled room to room without footsteps. In the margins of schoolbooks salvaged from town, one of them drew shapes she could not explain. Circles folded inward. Lines that looped back on themselves. faces without mouths, trees whose branches grew into roots. When asked why she drew the same forms repeatedly, she shrugged beneath her mask. Some things did not need reasons. They simply insisted on existing. Animals avoided the house after dark. Dogs refused to cross the property line. Chickens scattered at sounds no human could hear. On more than one morning, small creatures were found dead near the tree line. No marks, no blood, just stillness. The family buried them without comment. Death was familiar there. It did not require ceremony. Visitors were rare, but when they came, the air thickened. A pastor once stayed long enough to bless the rooms. He prayed loudly, as if volume might reach what words could not. His eyes lingered too long on the masks. When he left, he did not return. His sermons afterward spoke of closed communities and inherited sin, though no names were mentioned. As the sisters moved into adulthood, confusion settled over their identities. They were women by age, children by dependence, elders by the weight they carried. The lines blurred. They spoke of memories that belonged to their mother, of dreams that echoed stories told by their grandmother. Time folded inward the way bloodlines had. Past and present shared the same room. One winter, a fire broke out in a neighboring valley. Flames lit the sky orange, visible even from the house with its curtains drawn. The sisters watched through cracks in the fabric as smoke rose like a signal. They felt something, then that surprised them. Relief. Somewhere else, something was being exposed. That night, they heard voices near the property. Men arguing. The brother returned late, his clothes smelling of ash and sweat. He said little. But afterward, family papers disappeared from a locked drawer. Old photographs were burned in the stove. Names erased one by one. The house exhaled as history turned to smoke. The sisters sensed the truth circling closer, not as revelation, but as pressure. Their bodies hurt more. Their breathing worsened. Pain sharpened into something almost articulate. It felt like accusation, like the past demanding acknowledgement. They began to ask questions quietly, cautiously, about why no one married outside the family, about why faces in old pictures looked distorted in familiar ways. The answers were soft and final. This is how it has always been. This is how we survive. But survival had a cost, and the house was full of unpaid debts. By the time the doctor came, decades later, the truth was already there, waiting. It had grown into bone and cartilage, into habits and silence, into masks worn so long they no longer felt removable. The night before his arrival, one of the sisters wrote in her diary by candlelight. The ink shook on the page. She wrote that she felt older than her years, that her body remembered things she had never lived, that sometimes, when she touched her face beneath the cloth, she felt as if she were touching everyone who came before her. She did not know then how close she was to the moment when the family's careful silence would finally be named. The doctor arrived in the late 1970s, long after the family believed the world had forgotten them. His car struggled up the narrow road, engine laboring as if it sensed it did not belong there. He carried a leather bag worn thin at the corners and a notebook he would later describe as heavier than any instrument he owned. He was invited inside without warmth or resistance, just acceptance, the kind reserved for inevitabilities. What he saw unsettled him not because it was grotesque, but because it was orderly. The sisters sat side by side, back straight, hands folded. Their masks were clean, carefully stitched, each slightly different. One suggested a faint smile. Another was blank. The third carried an expression that might once have been sorrow. It was impossible to tell where cloth ended and identity began. Examinations were conducted slowly. Consent was given with nods, gestures practiced over a lifetime. When the oldest sister lifted her mask, the doctor did not recoil. He would later write that the effort it took not to react was one of the most difficult moments of his career. Bone had grown where space should have been. The jaw pulled sideways, teeth crowded into angles meant for no mouth at all. The skull bore the subtle compression of generations folding inward. The second sister followed. Then the third. Patterns emerged immediately, not random deformity, not isolated mutation. This was repetition, echo, a condition fed and refined across time. The doctor asked about family history. The brother answered first, too quickly. Cousins had married, yes, but only distantly. The mountains made options scarce. Gods will explain the rest. But records have a way of speaking when people do not. Parish books were produced reluctantly. Census pages yellowed with age. Names looped back on themselves. Fathers sharing surnames with mothers. Grandparents appearing twice on the same tree. A family structure that did not branch, only circled. The truth surfaced quietly, without drama. The sisters were born of parents who were first cousins. Those parents themselves were the children of cousins, and before them the same. 7 generations at least, possibly more, where blood married blood under the protection of isolation and scripture. The family tree did not just fold, it collapsed. The doctor explained what this meant in careful language, avoiding blame. Recessive traits awakened by repetition. Genetic instructions amplified instead of diluted. A body following orders written too many times. The sisters listened without interruption. This was not revelation to them. It was confirmation. What unsettled the doctor most was not the science, but the reaction. No tears, no anger, only a shared stillness, as if a door long suspected had finally been opened. One sister asked a single question, her voice muffled behind cloth. Was it avoidable? The doctor hesitated before answering. Honesty felt cruel, but lies felt worse. Yes, he said. That word settled into the room like ash. The brother stood abruptly. The interview ended. The masks were lowered. The sisters were guided back into shadow. Outside, the doctor sat in his car for nearly an hour before leaving. He wrote later that the air felt heavier there, as if the mountains themselves were complicit. That the silence was not empty, but enforced. Within days, the town knew something had been disturbed. Looks lingered. Church doors closed early. A meeting was held without records. Old resentments surfaced under the guise of concern. When truth enters a place built on secrecy, it does not heal, it burns. And soon, the town would decide that what had been uncovered needed to disappear again. The reaction did not come all at once. It seeped in, quiet and coordinated, like groundwater finding old cracks. No one announced what would be done. No vote was taken. The town understood these matters instinctively. Some things were not meant to survive daylight. Animals were the first to suffer. Goats went missing from properties near the house. Chickens were found slaughtered and left where they fell, a warning without words. The message was simple. What you are has consequences for all of us. One night, the smell of smoke returned to the valley. Not from the sisters' house, not yet, but close enough to be seen from their curtained windows. A shed burned. Then another. Papers were taken from a small church office and fed to the fire. Marriage registers. Baptismal notes. Anything that connected names too clearly was reduced to ash. The brother did not come home that night. When he returned the next morning, his hands shook. He told the sisters they would be staying inside for a while, as if they ever did anything else. A week later, men arrived at the edge of the property. They did not cross the boundary. They stood there, hats in hand, eyes fixed on the house. One carried a can of fuel. Another held matches. No threats were spoken. None were needed. The fire, when it came, was controlled. Deliberate. The barn went first. Then the outer fence. Flames climbed just high enough to be seen, low enough to be denied. The house itself was spared, not out of mercy, but strategy. Burning it would draw attention. This was about erasure, not spectacle. Inside, the sisters sat together in the dark. Smoke slipped through the cracks and settled into their lungs, already weak. They did not panic. Panic required belief in escape. When the fire died, silence returned heavier than before. After that, the rules tightened. No visitors, no doctors, no questions. The family withdrew further, sealing itself like a wound that refused to heal properly. The town, satisfied that the truth had been cauterized, looked away again. Years passed. The oldest sister's breathing worsened first. Each inhale sounded like cloth tearing. She slept sitting up, mask still in place, as if even death did not deserve her uncovered face. When she died, there was no service. She was buried at dawn, grave unmarked, her mask folded carefully and placed beside her. The second followed years later. Hearing gone entirely by then, she lived in a world of vibration and memory. She died quietly, hands clasped, as if waiting for instruction that never came. The youngest remained alone in the house that remembered everything. She continued the routines. Woke before dawn, soothed by failing light, wore her masks even when no one remained to see them. By the time she died, the town had nearly succeeded in forgetting. But forgetting is not the same as erasing, because records have a way of surviving where people do not. And decades later, someone would come looking, not for monsters, not for spectacle, but for answers buried under deliberate silence. The house would be entered again, and this time, the past would not stay quiet. The researcher arrived in the late 1980s, drawn not by rumor, but by absence. A gap in the data, a region where statistics bent unnaturally, where birth defects clustered and then vanished from the record, as if edited out by hand. He had learned to distrust clean narratives. Places that looked orderly on paper were often the ones that hid the most. County archives offered little. Files ended abruptly. Pages were missing, not torn but neatly removed. Ink stopped mid-sentence. Names appeared once and were never mentioned again. When he asked the clerk about it, she shrugged without meeting his eyes and said fires were common in old buildings. She said a lot of things burned back then. He followed land records instead, properties that never changed hands, taxes paid on time, every time, by the same family for over a century. One address appeared again and again, annotated only with initials after a certain year. No full names, no occupants listed. The house was still standing when he reached it, weathered, smaller than photographs suggested, as if it had been shrinking. Curtains hung in place, stiff with age. The door was locked, but the lock was old. It yielded easily, as though it had been waiting. Inside, the air carried that familiar weight. Dust layered everything evenly, undisturbed. Furniture remained where it had last been used. 3 chairs by the window, sewing tools laid out with care. No mirrors anywhere. He noticed that immediately. In a back room, he found them. Masks, folded neatly in a wooden chest lined with yellowed cloth. Dozens of them. Different fabrics, different expressions. Some carefully embroidered, others plain and functional. Each one shaped by hands that had learned to replace flesh with thread. He documented them in silence. Photographed, measured, catalogued. Only later would he admit that touching them felt intrusive, like handling someone's face without permission. In a locked drawer beneath the chest, He found a diary. The handwriting was delicate, uneven in places, as if written by someone whose hands did not always obey. Entries spoke of daily routines, pain, dreams of walking through town unnoticed. One passage repeated in different words across years. I try to remember what my real face feels like. Sometimes I think the mask is the only one that ever existed. Medical notes surfaced elsewhere. A doctor's private papers donated to a university, partially sealed. Clinical language struggled to contain what it described. Severe craniofacial malformations, mandibular asymmetry, hearing loss, respiratory compromise, and, written once in the margin, almost apologetically, multi-generational consanguinity. The researcher traced family lines outward, then inward. The tree did not grow. It spiraled. Names looped back. Mothers reappeared as aunts. Fathers as uncles. In one instance, a woman occupied 2 positions on the same chart. The realization came slowly, then all at once. This was not an accident of geography alone. It was sustained, defended, rationalized until it became sacred. When the researcher attempted interviews, doors closed. Phone calls went unanswered. One elderly man told him quietly to stop digging. Some things, he said, were paid for already. The masks were eventually archived, stripped of context, displayed briefly as curiosities before being returned to storage. The diary was sealed. The house was boarded up, then quietly demolished years later under the pretense of safety concerns. What remained were fragments. Enough to know, not enough to heal. And beneath it all lingered a question the researcher never wrote down, but carried with him afterward. At what point does survival become cruelty? And who decides when a family's tradition crosses the line into inheritance of suffering? The mountains did not answer. They never do. Long after the house was gone, the land kept its memory. Grass refused to grow evenly where the foundation had been. In winter, snow melted there first, as if the ground beneath still breathed. Hunters avoided the area without knowing why. Their dogs pulled back, whining softly, ears flat. The researcher published carefully: no names, no coordinates, just patterns. Genetic isolation, cultural reinforcement. Silence mistaken for consent. The paper circulated briefly, then disappeared into academic obscurity. Cited rarely, discussed even less. It was easier that way. Easier to treat the case as anomaly rather than mirror. But stories do not need permission to travel. Local children began telling a version of it that drifted far from facts but clung to the core. Women without faces. A house that swallowed light. Masks that moved on their own at night. In these stories, the sisters became something else. Warnings, symbols, monsters stripped of their humanity because it made the tale simpler to hold. What was never included was the patience, the years of routine, the quiet endurance of bodies failing slowly and politely. Horror, when rendered truthfully, is rarely loud. In medical circles, the case became a footnote in discussions of consanguinity. Charts were shown, percentages cited. The sisters were reduced to silhouettes on slides, their lives compressed into bullet points. No one mentioned the sewing, or the way they woke before dawn to avoid being seen, or the fact that they wore their masks even when alone. The last sister's grave was eventually found by accident during a land survey. Unmarked, shallow. When remains were examined, the skull told the story the records would not. Bone growth distorted by repetition. Airways narrowed by inherited design. A body shaped by decisions made long before she could speak. The mask was not buried with her. It had been kept, folded, stored, perhaps waiting. There is a temptation, when confronted with stories like this, to assign blame cleanly, to condemn the parents, the church, the town. to imagine a moment where someone could have intervened and did not. Those moments existed. Many of them. But they were small, easy to step over, easier to justify. No one wakes up intending to build a nightmare for their children. They build habits instead. Traditions. Rules meant to protect something fragile. Over time, those protections harden. They stop serving life and start shaping it. The sisters were not cursed. They were inherited. Inherited silence. Inherited belief. Inherited bone. And the masks were never about hiding from the world alone. They were about maintaining a boundary. This is ours. Do not look. Do not ask. Do not interfere. Even now, similar boundaries exist elsewhere. In valleys and hollows and remote towns, where roads end and names repeat. Where medical pamphlets never arrive, or arrive and are ignored. Where suffering is normalized because it is familiar. The story does not end with fire or revelation. It ends the way it began, quietly, with a closed door, with fabric folded and put away, with a family line thinning until it simply stops. What remains is not spectacle, but residue. A question that lingers without resolution. And an understanding that some faces are hidden, not because they are frightening, but because the world that shaped them refuses to be seen. There is a final detail the records never agree on. Some say the last mask was found neatly folded, placed on the windowsill facing the trees. Others insist it was discovered buried beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth that once might have been a dress. The disagreement does not matter. Both versions point to the same truth. Even at the end, concealment was deliberate. Those who studied the case later spoke of it with distance, as if distance could protect them. They used careful language, ethical failures, cultural isolation, genetic inevitability, words designed to keep emotion at bay. But in private correspondence, some admitted the unease never left them, that the story followed them home, that they dreamed of cloth against skin, of eyes staring through stitched openings, asking questions no chart could answer. Because beneath the science, beneath the sociology, there was something more disturbing. The sisters did not rebel. They did not run. They did not expose their family or demand the world intervene. They adapted. They learned how to live inside the damage handed to them. They built routines around pain. They found dignity where none was offered. And in doing so, they became invisible in the most complete way possible. That is the part people struggle to accept. Evil is easier to recognize when it screams, when it arrives with violence or spectacle. But here, it whispered. It wore the voice of tradition, of protection, of love misdirected and repeated until it deformed everything it touched. The family believed they were preserving something sacred, their land, their faith, their lineage. What they preserved instead was suffering, passed down carefully, like an heirloom no one remembered choosing. And the town allowed it, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. Afraid of disruption, afraid of shame, afraid of what their own records might reveal if opened fully. So they looked away, burned what threatened to speak. Let the masks do their work. Even now, when the land is quiet and the house long gone, the story remains unfinished. Not because details are missing, but because the pattern continues elsewhere, in different names, different valleys, different justifications. Somewhere, someone is being born into a family that will tell them this is normal. That pain is proof of belonging, that the world outside is dangerous, cruel, unworthy of trust. And they will believe it, because belief is easier than loneliness. So the final question is not about the sisters. It is about you. What would you do if you discovered that the person who raised you was also your cousin, your aunt, your sister? Would you tear the records open and let the truth burn through everything you know? Or would you lower the curtains, stitch the mask tighter, and tell yourself that survival, at any cost, is still survival? Some families end with graves. Others end with silence. And sometimes, the most haunting legacy is not what happened, but how easily it was allowed to keep happening.